My name's Tim Schaefer, and I'm going to be speaking about some of the roots of civic discourse within the cooperative extension system and the broader land-grant university. This is important for a couple reasons. One, we may not always realize the breadth or the depth to which this work has occurred. And secondly, as might be more a probable response, people just don't know about some of these experiences that we have in our past. So to begin, I want to frame this conversation first as a discussion around this idea of civic professionals. How do we think about ourselves and look back at these others as employing both technical expertise alongside kind of public regarding work? As Scott Peters and William Sullivan both put it in similar ways, how do we think about the use of technical expertise grounded in this idea of serving public ends? How do we do the work that we are committed to in these public regarding ways? As we think about the cooperative extension system, much of it goes back to 1914 with the passage of the Smith-Lever Act, which established the cooperative extension system as we know it. There were earlier iterations and versions of this at the state level and in local communities, but the Act in 1914 really established this model as we now know it. There are a couple points within that Act, though, that are significant to note, especially as we think about the role of education and how extension agents, educators, would engage their communities, their audiences, and otherwise. Fundamentally, the Act's language is in this idea of diffusing to people practical information on a variety of subjects, particularly in agriculture and human ecology. So there is this explicit sense of using demonstration methods which had preceded the establishment of the extension system itself that really played a central role. But there were other traditions as well, which we'll speak about in just a moment. One of the kind of quintessential images comes from Norman Rockwell of the county agent, going and solving, addressing the problems that happen or are happening on farms and in communities. So we see here checking the health of a calf. In other situations, you might think of extension agents going and solving problems using resources from the universities but employing them at that local level. At the beginning of the 20th century, though, there were other voices. People like Liberty Hyde Bailey at Michigan State and then later at Cornell University, who talked about the role of the land-grant college being a guiding force, but it should remove the responsibility of people in local communities. Their work should be cooperative. It really should be relational. And if it's not that, then there's a significant problem. This coming from his book called The Holy Earth in 1915. In an article called 6 Million Farms a School from 1930, Clyde Warburton asked this question: what is the object of extension work? Is it more bushels of corn, more bales of cotton, more pounds of butter? Is it more fruit and vegetables? These are means to an end. The end, the object of extension work, as he puts it, is the aid the farmer and the family, we would think everyone, of improving living conditions and a satisfying life. And as he concluded, better crops, better livestock, better food, better clothes. These are among the objects of extension work. But back of it all, the ultimate purpose is to create better homes, better citizens, better communities, better rural living. These comments from Liberty Hyde Bailey and Clyde Warburton are significant because they give us a more nuanced view of extension's past. There are roles and expectations of providing technical expertise and knowledge, but there was a larger vision, as many would say, a more democratic vision of what these institutions were supposed to do, what they were charged to do, and how this was to be realized through the work of extension agents in local communities. We see some of this show up. Here's an image from a collection of circulars from the Illinois Agriculture Experiment Station. So amongst reports, very significant and important reports, I want to note, this is not an either or, but in the midst of that kind of work, there were also these efforts to cultivate what was called then group discussion. This idea of how do we convene people in small groups to organize and to facilitate important conversations around shared concerns. So I want to use this as a jumping point to speak to a specific context and an example from the 1930s and early 1940s. through the USDA in partnership with land-grant universities, in particular the Cooperative Extension System. So let's set a bit of the scene. The economic crash of 1929, the Great Depression. Across the country and frankly around the world, the economy was in a spiral. People were experiencing layoffs, loss of work, loss of homes, the eventual environmental concerns, the Dust Bowl. All of these things were happening. And we had this bit of a paradox. We have a certain narrative about kind of the American life, the American economy, and the reality in both urban settings as well as rural communities that people were facing significant challenges. So, with the election of President Roosevelt and the implementation of the New Deal, this idea of the federal government playing a significant role in the lives of individuals and communities and the entire nation, there was experimentation with what role institutions could have and should have, and what role citizens would have as well. So, in March of 1933, President Roosevelt assumes office. And just 2 months later, there was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was a first step, a very explicit step, to try to address what was going on in rural communities, which had reverberations in many other places as well. And so we have the establishment of what ended up being kind of alphabet soup, entities within the federal government charged with these roles. You see the AAA, the WPA, and others. Some of this was well received, but for others there was a deep sense that these approaches taken by the federal government were overstepping, that the Congress, and particularly the White House, were doing more than they ought. And so we have a sense in the midst of this time of great upheaval and uncertainty that maybe there was too much intervention, as this sign puts it very, very plainly, that this individual farm was not receiving government aid. So in the midst of paying farmers to have fields lay fallow and to slaughter animals in order to raise prices, there's an interest within the USDA to do something different. And there are administrators, Secretary Henry A. Wallace and others, chose to do deliberative and educational work that emphasized the role of citizens in a democracy. Some of those individuals are pictured here. People like M.L. Wilson and H.R. Tolley, who had a vision for American democracy and the role of colleges and universities and of the federal government, particularly the USDA, in helping to cultivate a different kind of life. In 1935, a gathering of university administrators and federal bureaucrats and employees, M.L. Wilson has this to say: "Perhaps we haven't given enough attention to the farmer as a citizen." And he goes on to say, he's heard this from many places, that there is a recognition that people want to talk about the things that are affecting their lives and to try to understand them, as he says, to see what they mean. And hearing this from land-grant colleges, from farm organization leaders, and from ordinary farm men and women themselves, they heard this call. So what do? They unveil an effort which was rooted in this idea of free and full discussion being the archstone of democracy, the idea that ordinary people discussing issues that were affecting them, their communities, their regions, the state, country, and even the world, were foundationally built upon this idea of democratic discussion. That's what holds it all together. And so there was an effort across the country in different regions, from Iowa and Kansas to Massachusetts and New York, all the way down to North Carolina and to Oklahoma and Utah, Washington, from the East Coast to the West Coast and through the Midwest, an experiment of group discussions. And what was implemented was two complementary kind of programs. First, this idea of discussion groups. Topical issues were created, resource guides for small group discussion. These were primarily used in rural communities, and the USDA freely disseminated these materials at the request of extension agents who were playing the on-the-ground role of facilitating and organizing these. There were also extended educational programs called Schools of Philosophy. These were multi-day programs including lectures in the morning by noted scholars who were both in support and opposition to much of what was going on during the New Deal, and then there would be discussions in the afternoon. What was significant was that these were originally convenings for extension agents and then later for other community leaders. But for people who were trained in agriculture or home economics, human ecology, as we would say now, they were talking about things like philosophy, history, psychology, and sometimes even religious questions, all as they connected to what they referred to as the agricultural problem. But it was this idea of education and group discussion, deliberative democracy, all being kind of bundled up together. So we have some responses, clippings from the local newspaper in New Bern, North Carolina, noting that the discussion was catching fire with people. It was gaining favor as people were discussing a variety of topics, such as tax exemptions and land use. As one participant in those discussions in North Carolina said, "We have organized what we hope is a permanent discussion group in our county. I don't think there is anything the government could do that would benefit more people than to finance a group in at least every county in the U.S. I think this work could be done more successfully through our land-grant colleges." So there was this very intentional effort to see extension playing a central role in these conversations. So these materials, what did they look like? They were relatively brief, often 18, 20 pages or so. There were a number of topics and themes, but there was one overarching guide. So what kind of agricultural policy is necessary to save our soil, as this discussion guide notes? And so it would be framed, there would be a number of kind of prompts or questions. And then the rest of the guide would often be laid out as a give and take, framed more of it as a narrative, as a conversation between people who had maybe conflicting but uncertain views on the matter at hand. There would be factual information, but importantly, this was not the USDA offering propaganda, but it was really rooted in the idea of encouraging and cultivating conversation amongst people to have informed understanding and knowledge about the problems that they were facing. So we have this experiment happening, as I noted a moment ago, across the country. As you can see from this report of Iowa, one of the states that had a lot of work going on, there were efforts across that state, particularly in the winter when farmers had more time in the off season, to gather in front rooms, in grain chawls, church basements, any public space or what could become public space for these conversations. You see here a flyer from the Extension Service review of these different discussion materials as the series was being implemented for the following year after that experimentation early in 1935 and then continuing on. Every year there would be additional guides produced, freely disseminated to Extension for their use. An easier way to see some of these topics. Things like taxes, tensions between urban and rural communities, soil conservation, farm finance. A range of topics were being discussed in these topical materials, as well as resources being utilized for introduction to this discussion method for those who were facilitating these conversations, as well as for those who were participating. Another discussion guide here speaks to the idea of the challenge of surplus products. Where do they find markets? What I want to draw your attention to is the visual that's included here, of how intentional it was for these conversations to be inclusive of the diverse populations who lived in communities. So alongside the discussion leader, there was the president of the local farm organization, but there was the farmer who raised truck crops, as it says, the woman who runs her own farm, the older gentleman who has been at this for many years and maybe has certain approaches, as well as the farmer who does not want government aid. Having the range of perspectives and voices was always very important in this work, and is a guide for us thinking about this today. As I noted, there were also these resources for training and introducing people to the idea of discussion. How do you facilitate this kind of conversation? How is this different from having a panel or a lecture? And so it would get very practical of how do you literally sit down? How do you create the space, the environment? How do you make everybody comfortable? Getting to the issue of checking ventilation and lighting. Making sure that people know one another, learning names, having ways to document. So, as it notes here, a blackboard, chalk, and eraser, so you could capture those statements. Emphasizing that it's important to stay on time, and as the bullet at number 10 says in the left column, emphasize no speeches, no monopoly. After an opening statement, engage people in a way that gives everybody space to talk. And so there are lots of ways that we see this really in kind of practical manner. And then also for the participants in these discussions, similarly, how important it was for them to speak their minds, but also to listen thoughtfully. Keep your seat. Don't make a big dramatic kind of gesture, but how do you give some equity to what's going on? A few years later, a quite significant document collecting some of these different techniques speaks to the longer impact of this work. Thinking about the success of these discussions is, does it carry over, as it says? Does it continue over coffee? But also, does it linger well beyond the confines of the space? What is the conversation in a week, in 2 weeks' time? Capturing here a sentiment from a leading scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois, was particularly around issues of race. The schools of philosophy, these multi-day educational opportunities were going on across the country and inviting all sorts of people to engage in the process. He, here in writing for the Amsterdam News, speaks about his experience of traveling across the Southwest, participating in these. And as he says at the bottom of the first page onto the second, how important this was. And he says, I put it to you frankly, friends of Chicago, Washington, and Boston. Can you afford to miss this sort of thing? And can you continue to talk seriously and sincerely about race relations in America? He saw these opportunities for discussion to be of significant value. So as we think today about questions of race relations and civil discourse, we are able to build on the important work of many others. Efforts to establish this kind of conversation and approach across the country was echoed and captured by many. In Kansas, at Kansas State University, George Gemmell put it this way, saying, a specialist in each state working through the Extension Service could profitably devote full time to the training of leaders. And there were states that did this, that committed particularly Extension agents to this work, playing the role of state discussion group leader. From Oklahoma, we can see this visual at the top, looking at the national kind of leadership through the USDA, down through the state, all the way to the local levels and to the hyper local, the PTAs, the civic organizations, the 4-H clubs. Supporting all of this work, all of this discussion work, was Extension, the backbone, if you will, of this effort. And we see this showing up in much of Extension's work throughout this period, from the mid-1930s well into the 40s to the mid-1940s. So here's a multi-day Extension Workers Conference, but in 1937 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we see that this was all framed and built off this idea of the schools of philosophy. Carl Tosh, the director of the Program Study and Discussion Unit of the USDA, the organization producing these materials, spoke about that first morning on Monday, philosophy's contribution to the present situation, inviting people to speak about and think about these questions in a more reflective kind of way. States also, importantly, utilized federal resources, guides, materials, but also cultivated the conversations that needed to happen in their own communities. And there was encouragement to do so. There was not a limitation of only using certain materials or guides, but really the USDA saw this as an opportunity to leverage their resources to cultivate those conversations at that local level, but really strongly encouraged Extension with other community members and leaders to create their own resources and materials as necessary. So why is this all important? As Kenyon Butterfield, a significant figure in the establishment of the entire Extension system, said in a letter to M.L. Wilson, I think this discussion project is one of the most significant developments in Extension work since the Smith-Lever Act was passed. I've been waiting for a long time for someone to take the initiative in this field. So for us today, as we try to make sense of this idea of civil discourse within the cooperative extension system, it's important to note that we've had these periods in our past where group discussion, civil discourse was encouraged, not only encouraged, but really developed through our institutions, that for us today, we can reclaim, identify, and augment and develop our own ways of cultivating this idea of democracy. Because as M.L. Wilson put it, free and full discussion is in fact the archstone of democracy. Thank you.